The Straw Hats never fight Kuma, are never split up, and all enter the new world in their pre-timeskip states. What happens then? There are many events in One Piece that completely change the course of the series. Everything from Zoro meeting Mihawk way back in Baratier, to Luffy being saved just in time by the totally normal lightning in Logtown. And while all of these events sent huge ripples throughout the story, I would argue that among all of these, the events of Sabaody still stand out as one of the most, if not the most crucial turning points in all of One Piece. So naturally, as I lie there in bed trying to deconstruct the world of One Piece and predict what Oda will do next, I often find myself asking that one pesky question of, what if? So what if the Straw Hats never fight Kuma? What if we never get Frankie's Ora Ora moment? What if they are never split up and go right down to Fishman Island as originally planned? For the sake of this little thought exercise, I will channel my inner Luffy and just stretch the story a little just to make things fit. And I also certainly welcome all of you to throw out your what-if scenarios in the comments as well. That said, the opening of our alternate Sabaody of course plays out exactly the same. They meet up with Achan, Kami, Patrick, and Budget Sanji. Said Budget Sanji becomes Handsome Squidward, and we head on over to Sabaody just like the original timeline. What complicates this little exercise is that even before the crew lands on Sabaody, at Marie Joie, Sengoku was already salty with Kuma about not going after the Straw Hats like originally planned. This of course means that, with or without the events of the auction, at least Kuma is dispatched for the Straw Hats yet again. On top of that, Garp also soon learns that Rayleigh is being sold at the auction, which, for the sake of this thought exercise, we will assume prompts him to also head on over to Sabaody, sort of like he alluded to doing in the original timeline. Meanwhile, back at our alt Sabaody, just like the original timeline, the crew begins their search for Rayleigh, which of course involves a couple of hours of quality procrastination. Though, they of course soon learn that Kami has been kidnapped. And this is where we have to introduce a major divergence from the main timeline, because it is the presence of the celestial dragons that kind of throws a spanner in this entire thought exercise. The coding of the ship takes 3 days to complete, meaning that if any of the Straw Hats get in trouble with a celestial, we would have a very heavy response from the Navy, one which we can't really escape due to the aforementioned coding. So in other words, we would converge back to the main timeline and the Straw Hats would be defeated. So in this timeline, for whatever reason, no Celestials are involved with anything that happens in Sabaody. Zoro never runs into Sharlos, Rosward and his daughter don't exist, and most importantly, the legendary Celestial Dragon Punch never happens, and frankly, that is a goddamn travesty. And speaking of Luffy punching people back into the manga, the entire auction is also much different due to the absence of everyone's least favorite manchild. Because Sharlos isn't there to outbid the Straw Hats, they could technically just buy Kami back without too much hassle. But you know, because this is Luffy and this is One Piece, I have a hard time believing that they would just let all of this go. So you know what, let's throw that punch back in there, only instead of Sharlos, Luffy pummels Disco instead. And so we have our manga punch and all is right in the world. Hachan wouldn't really be shot here either, and the overall chaos wouldn't be as intense as it is with the Celestial Dragon being attacked. But the general idea of just everything going wrong, of course, still stands. Chaos erupts, and Rayleigh then makes his appearance, much like he does in the original timeline. The limited number of Marines still present on Sabaody encircle the auction, and the crew has to fight them off. Though a noteworthy change here caused by the absence of Sharlos are the reactions of the supernovas. As we don't have any World Noble shenanigans, they currently have no reason to just immediately pack up and leave, because they just don't expect an admiral to show up. And this little discrepancy might even benefit Luffy and the crew as things inevitably heat up in this little battle royale. It's important to note that the reason why Sabaody was comparatively quiet on the Navy front was because most of their forces were being prepped for Marineford. So if we have no World Nobles to speak of, much of this alternate Sabaody only really revolves around Luffy and that's about it. But okay, let's not jump ahead. While Luffy doesn't quite challenge the world government here, I would still expect Law and Kid to create a mini alliance of convenience here. So even in this timeline, I do think our captain trio do make their stand at the auction. And similar to the original timeline, Luffy eventually takes his exits and we then get the many a lore bomb from Rayleigh in the bar. And finally, get the big 3-day timer for the Sunny's coding to be completed. Because of this extended period of time where the crew is just sort of stuck now, many different things could theoretically happen. Everything from LEMMiNO coming over here to deal with the auction intrusions, to Tomorrow and the pacifistas being deployed, which would still result in the Strawhats being defeated. But just to keep things fun, let's ignore those scenarios as they all either result in everyone dying or the original timeline. Let's just say that neither one of them are concerned with these rookies stirring up trouble amongst themselves and rather just choose to focus on Marineford. At this point, I'd expect the worst generation to come out on top since it's just low-level Marines. And for a little while, things generally do tend to quiet down a bit. Though another complexity in this timeline is the arrival of Kuma. In this case, since there is no huge battle going on, doing this little pseudo-undercover separation of the crew is basically impossible. So at that point, the only real option is to face them head-on, at which point we are basically back to square one. There is an interesting dimension to explore here as to what might happen if they're all sent to Impel down straight away. Or maybe, the complete opposite, they're sent right to Baltigo to meet Dragon. Though at that point, things are just completely off the rails. They would meet up with Sabo, who, upon seeing Luffy, might have regained his memories super early, and then both of them would have ended up in Marineford. And while that is an entirely different rabbit hole to explore with a ridiculous number of potentially diverging paths, let's again focus on the more straightforward one with the assumption that Kuma just plays dumb and claims to have not found Luffy at all. Perhaps to maintain his cover, some of the other supernovas are caught in the crossfire instead, but the Straw Hat crew never faces him on Sabaody. Though because this is Sabaody, even in this fantasy alternate timeline, the craziness does not end there. Because sometime after Kuma, or actually potentially at the same exact time as Kuma if they use his power, Garp too finally arrives with his supposed personal mission with Rayleigh. And here, things once again get very complicated. Travel time in One Piece is often very wacky, so it's kinda hard to say whether he could arrive to Sabaody within those 3 days if they don't use Kuma's power. If he never arrives, things go relatively smoothly, and more on that in a second. If he does arrive, well, the story is sort of blown wide open. Luckily, we at least have some precedent on how such an interaction would go, with Post-Enies Lobby largely being the same exact scenario. Garp arrives with what looks to be an intention to capture Luffy, only for us to then find out that it was basically just Kobe wanting to meet him and he doesn't really intend to capture Luffy right up until he knows that they will most definitely escape. In this case, I honestly think a similar scenario would play out, with Garp, just like he mentioned before in Marie Joie, not wanting to start what is largely a pointless conflict with Rayleigh. I mean, let's be real here, this is One Piece. I wouldn't even be surprised if we just suddenly see them reminisce about their old rival days and talk about Roger and whatnot. But you know, there is still that one teeny tiny thing which I haven't mentioned, which I think might affect all of this, and yes, that is Ace. I mean, yeah, saying the crew would spend 3 whole days in Sabaody without reading the newspaper about Ace is already a huge stretch. But if Garp runs into Luffy, I mean, there is absolutely no way he isn't mentioned. But you know, maybe we could have gotten a bit of a role reversal of Garp begging Rayleigh to make sure Luffy doesn't try to pursue Ace, a la Roger asking Garp to take care of baby Ace in the first place. Hey, that actually sounds pretty neat. But for the sake of pushing this hypothetical to its limits, let us also ignore this potential meeting and say that Garp simply doesn't arrive in time for Luffy's departure. So, 3 days pass, the ship's coding is complete, somehow, definitely, they never meet Kuma and Garp, and somehow, none of them read the newspaper, which literally everyone and their mom is screaming about. Trust me, it makes sense. And as soon as they depart the alternate Sabaody, we have another list of things that immediately change by default. First and foremost, Luffy never meets Boa and doesn't gain Amazon Lily as his allies. So if this alternate timeline ever gets to Marineford and Boa actually shows up, we can instantly write off Sanji and Brook. Wait, does her power even work on Brook? He doesn't have any eyes and flesh can't turn to stone if you have no flesh, right? Anyway, another huge challenge is Surame chilling right before Fishman Island's entrance. Post-time skip, the crew actually ends up fighting it briefly, which in their current standing would have been either magnitudes more challenging, if not impossible. But again, let us say that they do not perish a slow and painful death. Let's just say that Luffy befriends it super quickly, and they don't engage it in combats, or at least not serious combats. And so, they reach Fishman Island, and unlike the original timeline, here things actually go super smooth. Keep in mind that Whitebeard is still alive and this is his territory, and Hody has still yet to come to power. So for the Strawhats, Fishman Island is actually super chill. They also arrive with Kami, Hachan, and Papag. I don't know how to say his name, so I'll just keep calling him Patrick. But yeah, with them by their side, they really face little to no troubles here. And because this is Oda, obviously the small change also changes many things like super long term. Like, for example, Luffy versus Big Mom is never established here. And the Sanji wedding, if that would even end up happening in some form, wouldn't be the same either, as the crew would have never received the Tamate box? Tamate box? Tomato box. Though at this point, I really don't see any potential scenario where somehow Luffy doesn't end up learning of what's going on with Ace. Even if it doesn't happen through a newspaper, I'd imagine that just someone somewhere would bring up how Whitebeard is on the move or something like that. So Fishman Island is really as far down the line as I can imagine pushing this. This naturally brings up an important question. How do we go on from here? Normally, we see them go on to Punk Hazard, which, by the way, would have also been completely different since the Aokiji-Akainu duel wouldn't have happened yet. But considering the Marineford war on the horizon, let's ignore the potential Punk Hazard storyline for now. In the original timeline, after being scattered, Luffy flew for 3 days, coincidentally the same amount of time as the ship coding. So purely time-wise, we are on Fishman Island at the same point as when Luffy learns of Ace's imprisonment and execution on Amazon Lily. And considering his reaction to the news in Amazon Lily, clearly he wouldn't write it off just saying, yeah, Ace will be fine on his own as he did in Thriller Bark. Which then brings us to the question of, if in this timeline we too want to take the fight to Impel Down, how in the world do we even get there? Unfortunately, One Piece doesn't really have an accurate map we can go by. However, what we do know is that it is in the Calm Belt. Also, one can only enter Impel Down from either Enies Lobby or Marineford, and it took Luffy 4 days to reach Impel Down from Amazon Lily by a government ship. And yes, these 3 facts alone basically doom the crew's chances of getting anywhere close to even entering Impel Down, let alone breaking into the prison itself. Is this where this little thought experiment ends? Luffy has no means of reaching Impel Down and that's it? Well, realistically, it ended like 3 pages ago, but since you're already here, let us use our own Gomu Gomu and stretch it even further. We are on Whitebeard's home turf, and on Fishman Island of all places, right? I don't want to go completely nuts here, so let's assume that Shirahoshi's power doesn't come into play here. Because 1, Luffy, or Neptune for that matter, probably wouldn't want it to go public. And 2, the Sea Kings do sorta have the power to sink entire islands, which would obviously change the course of Marineford, you know, just a little bit. So with those restrictions in mind, let us say that somehow, someway Luffy and the Straw Hats get a lift, either by Surume or someone or something else on Fishman Island, right on over to Impel Down. But wait, even if we travel to Impel Down, we're sort of ignoring all the authority hurdles Luffy has to jump through, right? Like, the only reason why Blackbeard made it to Impel Down was because he was a warlord. And the only reason why Boa could sneak Luffy in was also because she was a warlord, right? Well, realistically, if I can even say that anymore, I think the most viable scenario here is that Luffy skips Impel Down and the entire crew heads right on over to Marineford to join up with Whitebeard. But wait, let us entertain the idea that somehow he does sneak into Impel Down regardless. And because this alternate timeline is already reaching some very uncanny proportions, let us go full pedal to the metal and say that the Straw Hats meet up with Blackbeard. And once again, luckily for us, we do have a solid precedent as to how such a meeting would go, as they did kinda sorta meet up literally in the original timeline in Impel Down. Only in this case, they would still be on their way there. For the sake of this thought exercise, let us assume that Luffy is obviously enraged about Blackbeard defeating Ace and sending him to Impel Down in the first place. But, as is often the case in One Piece, let's say they put their differences aside and reconnect over their encounter at Jaya. And to pass the time a little bit, they have a pseudo-Davy backfight where Sanji faces off against, I don't know, someone on Blackbeard's crew to settle the eternal cherry pie versus meat debate once and for all. So at this point, we have what is the most unlikely of allies in the Straw Hat Pirates and the Blackbeard Pirates with the shared goal of breaking into Impel Down, with both of them immediately going down in history as the only pirates to ever intentionally break into the horrifying depths of Impel Down, and also as the only time the arch rivals fought side by side. God, what the hell am I even writing anymore? Only problem is, this is where things once again get quite complicated, because in the original timeline, Luffy takes a stroll down memory lane and reconnects with all their past enemies, because he goes in solo before all the carnage goes down. In this alternate timeline, however, remember that Blackbeard only arrives way later, more than 10 hours later in fact. So for this thought exercise, we will also do the same. This means that they wouldn't have chaos coming from both ends of the prison, and they would have to spearhead an entire attack top to bottom. But we have another problem. Blackbeard arriving later than Luffy in the original timeline also means that Ace's Viva card is already moving away even before Luffy gets to Impel Down, which begs the question of what's even the point of Luffy going to Impel Down? Let's again assume that Blackbeard knows they wouldn't be able to get through the Gates of Justice without gaining a foothold in Impel Down. So the Straw Hats are basically just roped in for the mission, with it just being a prerequisite for them to reach Marineford. And right from the get-go, this means that Ace never learns that Luffy is breaking in, as Hancock is never there to visit him. Similarly, at this point in the alternate timeline, a very long time would have passed with Buggy on the loose. So I don't really think they would run into each other as they do in the original one. Also, it's hard to say whether they'd ever cross paths with Mr. 3, the legend Bonchan, and most importantly, Eva and everyone in level 5.5, since their journey is basically just a series of unfortunate events where everything just so happens to line up perfectly. However, I also think there is a very likely scenario where Magellan just defeats all of them much like he does in the original timeline. And so, the entire Straw Hat crew is sent down to level 5, and potentially, we see an alternate version of someone saving Luffy, Eva learning that he is Dragon's son, etc, etc. And you know what? Let us entertain this idea. Blackbeard largely uses the Straw Hats as distractions, while he himself makes his way down to level 6, where, just like the original timeline, he frees a bunch of dudes. The Straw Hats, on the other hand, are all taken to level 5, where this time around, their forces are of course much more stacked, with it being their whole crew instead of just Bonchan and Luffy. Though we have a huge problem, because the only reason why Luffy is ultimately saved is because Bon Clay knew the legend of Eva, something no one else here is aware of. So, does everyone die here? Probably. No, you know what?
Yeah, it's rewind time.
As the crew sneaks around before they face off against Magellan and are defeated, they also cross paths with the legend Bon Clay himself. Okay, there we go, fixed. Similar to the original timeline, Eva and Inazuma are both shook by Luffy's dedication to his crew and Bon Clay, so they take him in. Okay, we have yet another problem, because in the real story, we have 10 hours of Luffy screaming in agony during which Blackbeard makes his way over here. So obviously, the Ace saving timeline is completely messed up in this version, and they basically have no chances of making it over there. So let us just make one last major stretch, and say that because the entire Straw Hat crew was present, Magellan just blasted them with some lighter poisons that wouldn't quite kill them, but just immediately incapacitated them for like, I don't know, half an hour. So at this point, the crew meets Eva and all the others, they learn that Luffy is Dragon's son, and so they team up. Because Ace is already gone, they have no reason to go to level 6, and this does however mean that they also never meet up with Jinbei or Crocky. And speaking of Crocky, Blackbeard has, through some shenanigans, made it down to level 6 and frees all the bad boys. And most likely, because this is Blackbeard, he probably just frees everyone to make escape easier, and he doesn't really care what they'll do after. So yeah, theoretically, Jinbei might have also been let go here, and maybe he still ends up in Marineford. Though with that, both of their crews now have to go bottom up through Impel Down. For simplicity's sake, we'll just assume that things play out mostly the same. Someone stays behind to open the Gates of Justice, and just like the original timeline, Luffy makes it out before Blackbeard, who just has a few more floors to cover. Meanwhile at Marineford, since nothing is yet directly affected by what happened with Luffy, Whitebeard's opening strikes play out exactly the same, with the only major difference being Boa, who has either just not showed up at all, or is fighting alongside the Marines. And because her power is another one of those all or nothing type of ones, if she is there, then she is certainly a powerhouse to go up against, turning every single thirsty individual in her vicinity to stone in an instant. Though just as the battle is heating up, a ship comes flying out of the sky, with none other than Luffy himself leading the charge, shortly followed by Zoro, who probably got lost midair and lands right next to Ace, where he is probably blasted, but then the rest of the crew also makes their debut. And if we've been off the rails for a majority of this alternate timeline, then here, largely thanks to the extremely tightly written narrative of Marineford, there aren't really that many places where the story can go. Obviously, at this point in the story, the Strawhats are small-time rookies compared to basically anyone else here. So as much as Zoro might charge Mihawk thinking that he has already become the best, they'll get folded if not instantly then. Actually no, instantly does sound about right. And so, the crew is sort of driven into a corner where I propose two possibilities. Firstly, assuming that Mr. 3 does still end up by Luffy's side, the final hurrah of Luffy and Ace plays out exactly the same. Ace is killed by Akainu, and it's the Straw Hats immediately trying to get Luffy out of there. Something that might end up being a lot more problematic since Jinbei wouldn't be by their side. But ultimately, they escape aboard Law's submarine, and instead of Jinbei being the one breaking through to Luffy, it is his entire crew helping him get through the trauma. Also, they would obviously not be on Amazon Lily since Luffy would have never been there, which also means that reuniting with Rayleigh may be an entirely different issue and the Marines may be hunting him down after the war. Not to mention the Sunny, which would still be on either Fishman Island, or if they actually travel this whole way on the Sunny, then simply destroyed at Marineford. And most of all, obviously no one on the crew would get their specialized training arc. So huge developments like Robin working with the revolutionaries, Zoro training under Mihawk, Frankie literally becoming a legend by blowing up Vegapunk's lab, and all the others just never happen. Hey Will, say the thing.
It's rewind time.
Let me propose another scenario, which yes, is very much a cop-out. As the battle at Marineford heats up, Kuma himself just bops the Straw Hats one by one, ultimately separating them just like Sabaody. It's a perfect cover-up for his mission just like Sabaody, and it also appears as a win-win for the Navy, so no one's the wiser. And again, because the crew is comparatively very weak, their presence during the war doesn't really skew the results in any meaningful way. Whitebeard is defeated, he announces that the One Piece is real, and memes are born. Though even with this much safer scenario, still comes many externalities. Notably, Luffy would have to either go to an entirely different location, or the entire Amazon Lily storyline would be massively different. Not only that, if Law is not the one to save Luffy at the end of the war, their entire post-war alliance also seems far less likely. And lastly, because Jinbei isn't there either, we again have the question of who might break through to Luffy and what happens if he is alone after the war. But ultimately, the answer to the question of what would happen if the Straw Hats were never split up at Sabaody is surprisingly simple. I think this won't come as a shock to anyone, but I think Oda wrote the entire Summit War saga and the preceding time skip as a huge wake-up call that the crew is not ready to conquer the Grand Line just yet. Even going all the way back to where this little thought exercise began on Sabaody. The number of hoops they would have to jump through to even get through the beginning of this little alternate timeline is borderline impossible. And for good reason. Sabaody is meant to be a crushing defeat. And if they were to somehow avoid it, well, again, I think the answer is simple and they would just straight up die during the Ace saving mission. As soon as you take Bo off the table and Luffy doesn't have that instant access to Impel down where everything just so happens to line up in his favor, I think this little hypothetical story just falls apart at the seams. Not to mention the fact that he is forced to awaken his Haki on Amazon Lily, something that, again, wouldn't happen. So knowing what we know now, the defeat at Sabaody is effectively just the Straw Hats being saved from what is almost certain death. And I think the fact that I've now spent, over 20 minutes rambling about the ins and outs of why it is so, just speaks to how well said defeat is written. It is the most important gatekeeper in the One Piece story that completely flips the board upside down, and ultimately sets up one of the most triumphant reunions in basically any story I've ever read. So, if you will excuse me, I will now forget all about this little wacky adventure where the greatest twist of One Piece doesn't happen, and take another quick trip back to Sabaody for reasons. And that's the video. Feels good to be talking about One Piece on the main channel again, and oh boy, is there plenty more planned already. If you want more like literally right now though, there is a whole bunch of stuff on the second channel as well. But anyway, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Magic Skeleton 69. Nice. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!